Happy Friday, everyone. This is Bryan Knutson, advisor with Cutler Investment Group, and it is a beautiful Friday afternoon. What else would I want to be doing on a Friday afternoon except having a beer? I'll tell you a little bit about that and talk about the difference between growth stocks and value stocks. And I know that's exactly what you all came for, not for the beer. So to dive right in, let's get into the most important part first. This beer is from Oregon. For my tip of the cap to my colleagues down there in the Medford area. This is from Eugene, from a company called Ninkasi, and it is the Dawn of the Red IPA. It's maybe a little stronger than some other IPAs. It's 7%. I love it. I think it tastes great. It's very smooth. It's very clean. It's got a little bit of that sort of peaty flavor from the red aspect, and it's great. So I'm going to have a little drink here before I dive into the world of growth versus value, how they differ, how they're similar, and how we look at the two styles as a complement to each other. Okay, so let's get into this. How do the growth and value styles of stocks differ, and how are they similar? Well, first thing is there are 505, for some reason, companies in the S&P 500. They threw in an extra 5 for fun. Out of those 505, the most recent filing for the growth index says there are 237 stocks that meet the growth criteria as set forward by S&P Global Incorporated. Okay, so if I do some quick math before I have too much beer, that would tell me that 505 total, 237 growth. If they were all distinct and only fit one style or the other, there would be 268 stocks in the S&P Value Index to make up that total. However, there are 440. Or actually, most recently, there were 435 because a few missed the criteria. So what does that tell me? There are far more stocks out of that one index that are called value than are called growth. Why is that? A couple different reasons. The biggest indicator for the value side is going to be things like book value, like its breakup value. It's going to be price to sales, and we've had some big increases in sales revenue relative to expectations as we're coming out of this pandemic period. So those indicators have cut a really wide swath and said, okay, maybe you're not a classic value style stock, maybe you don't even pay a dividend, but you meet enough of the criteria, we're going to let you in. On the growth side, the biggest indicator on the growth side is going to be sales volume, it's going to be momentum, and it's going to be the expectation of being able to get from the revenue number we're at now to a much higher revenue number in the future. That's why, if you look at those two styles, the classic assumption, which very often plays out, is that value is going to have a lower price to earnings ratio, and that is true. Right now, all PE ratios, price to earnings ratios, are a bit elevated, just given the situation where we stand. But the value index today, on the most recent indicator, has an average PE of about 19, maybe 19 and a half. On the flip side, the average PE, price to earnings ratio, for members of the growth index is almost 39. It is massively high. It's the highest that I've ever seen. And there are certain members in there, some of which, names like Tesla, for example, that people know, that are unbelievably high. Some of them don't even have a PE ratio, to be honest. But those that do, there are multiple members in the hundreds, multiple hundreds, over 1,000 even. That is really skewing up that total. So the other aspect that is often thought of is that value stocks pay a dividend and growth stocks don't. That's not necessarily true. Again, a lot of it because of that overlap that I noted before. The value index right now has an average dividend yield of about 2%. The growth index is closer to about 0.5%, give or take. So each of those, if you just bought the index, each of them would have some level of yield, but of course, one of them is much higher. Energy stocks, financial stocks, ones like that tend to have a history of paying higher than average dividends will most likely be filed into the value side. One other indicator to think about right now, or one other note that's really important, is the growth index is incredibly concentrated. Out of those 230 plus names, like I noted before, 3 of them make up 28%. So over a quarter of that index is comprised of 3 names. It's 3 names that will not be surprising. It is Apple, it is Microsoft, it is Amazon, right? The biggest 3 players make up a massive amount of that index. On the value side, it's much more evenly distributed, partially because you have so many more holdings, partially because none of them are that much bigger than everybody else. The 3 biggest holdings of that index add up to 8%, right? So less than a third as much as the concentration on the growth side. The biggest name there would be Berkshire Hathaway, and then it goes on down the line from there. Also, when you think about the industries that are involved in each of these respective benchmarks, oftentimes growth gets thought of as the tech benchmark. Well, tech does make up 40% of the growth benchmark. That is a lot. However, the way that certain companies are denoted and how they're classified, the tech names might be surprising to some people. Netflix, Facebook, Amazon even, those are not tech companies. They're tech-related companies. They are definitely tech-heavy, but they are not thought of, as a tech company. They're not in that sector. Those the companies in the tech sector, Apple, Microsoft. Why Apple's not in something like consumer discretionary, I don't know, but it's not. So those do make up a massive amount of what is specifically the tech sector for anyone that's looking at a sector-specific type holding, but they are not necessarily going to be made up in the tech sector of other stocks that you would think of. That's not true. And then also there are certain sectors like healthcare has very close ratios. It's like 16% of one and 12% of the other, somewhere close to that. So even within sectors, there are certain companies, like a biotech stock on the one side is very different than Johnson & Johnson on the other side. So if you're thinking about these kind of holdings at a sector level, you want to be very aware of concentration risk and what is and is not constituted in a certain holding. What we do here is we do tend to have a value bias, not a deep value bias necessarily, but we are looking for companies that are industry leaders, that are trading at not outrageous valuations. But what those of you that are in our strategy would note is one of our biggest holdings is and has been Microsoft. Okay, well, Microsoft does pay a dividend, but Microsoft is also definitely a growth style stock in its what we call revenue trajectories and things like that. So it's a bit of a hybrid in between. One other thing that might be surprising to people, if you looked at the growth style and you look at its top 10 holdings, 2 of them are Visa and MasterCard. Not only that, Visa and MasterCard not only are considered growth style, they're considered tech stocks. Western Union is considered a tech stock. So the assumption of what people think about certain companies and what they do doesn't necessarily tie out to how they're classified. This is very important when I'm thinking about whether I want to be growth oriented or value oriented. What do we do here? We use both, right? We have ratios between those different kinds of holdings, and really it's going to come down to the strategy that's implemented inside of the holdings that you're using. Because again, there's not that much difference at a macro level between these because there's so much overlap. Right? And if you buy a value style benchmark, please be aware you are once again owning 80+% given the ratios that over 430 of those holdings out of 505, which is a big, big number, are going to be in that value benchmark. So really all you're doing there is excluding certain things. That's why what we like to do is have a fairly concentrated portfolio, looking for industry leaders, looking for good growing dividends, not the highest dividends. That is a strategy that's worked out well for us. But essentially, when you think of growth versus value, I would really ask you all to not think of it as versus, think of it as growth and value. How do they complement each other? How do we assimilate those two together and come up with a good outcome for our big U.S. stock allocations and other pieces where that would apply to small cap, to foreign, everywhere like that. So I hope this helps. I hope this gave you some information. I hope you can all have a beer like I am. And I hope everyone is staying safe, staying well, and we will talk to you soon. Thanks very much. Bye.